Hmm. Let's talk about joy. Joy is your birthright, and without joy, there can only be misery, suffering, and sorrow. True joy is not dependent upon anything in particular being any kind of way in the external world. In fact, joy is simply the nature of your being when it's left unmessed with. The barrier between joy and yourself, or yourself and your liberation, it means the same thing, is guilt. So then I suppose we're also going to talk about guilt. Guilt is useless. There's absolutely no purpose for it. And I wish that you would simply release it and let go of it. It is that easy. It really is that easy. But if you don't see that, then there are certain ways to ascend that mountain. There are paths that lead up to that summit of guiltlessness, of shamelessness, of being totally free. And first and foremost, you have to have at least the inkling that you can be free, or a desire, however small the flame, or however fantastically vital that deep conscious need in you is to be free. It has to be there in some degree, because if you still want to remain shackled to guilt and to shame, then you will be. If you're still telling yourself some story about how you owe the world your guilt, or how you owe the world your shame, or how you owe the world your suffering, because how dare you be joyful, how dare you be free of shame, of suffering, of guilt in a world where there is so much injustice and so much pain and so much suffering and so much turmoil and conquest and everything that we know to be reprehensible to the human spirit. But that's simply a way of allowing your inner self, of allowing yourself really to be taken hostage by those forces that seek to take hostages. So, suffering in order to feel, to appease the guilt that asks you to be in solidarity with those who are suffering, is not real solidarity, and it's no solution to the problem that is in our faces. A human being that is in sovereignty, that is in consciousness, knows that nobody has the right to make them or cause them to suffer. A human being in sovereignty knows that they have the right to feel whatever they want to feel, however they want to feel it, whenever they want to feel it. And that nobody else has the right to cause you or to make you feel anything. A sovereign human being does not want emotional control over another human being, nor does a sovereign human being wish to be emotionally controlled, which means mentally controlled as well. Thought and emotion are one. A sovereign human being says, my thought is my thought, and my emotion is my emotion, and I will use thought as I wish to use thought, and I will feel as I wish to feel. And therefore, there's no desire to impose any kind of sentimentality upon anybody else. There's no need to. When you're free, and everybody is free, and you're simply here then, able to enjoy everything you see, everything you hear, the very breath that you're breathing into your lungs, the food you eat, the water that you drink, the fact that you have a body, the fact that you're alive, that you are life. That's sufficient. There's nothing that needs to be extracted in terms of one's personal joy or happiness or peace or love from anybody else. You're simply being here is sufficient when you're paying attention and when you're in sovereignty. And so certainly, if there's a human being, and this appears to be the state of most human beings, not only today but going back for as long as we can remember, people are always seeking to extract joy, happiness, and pleasure from another. And that requires exploitation, that requires manipulation, that requires the desire to control, the desire to hold hostage. And when one is in that situation, whether as the exploiter or the exploited, if you are out seeking to exploit, and if someone is of the state of mind in which they allow themselves to be exploited by another inwardly, there's no joy. And why would you allow yourself to be exploited by another, to be mined by another for resources that they clearly have the capacity to find within themselves if only they wanted to? Guilt, which is essentially the same thing as fear. Fear is a part of that guilt. And shame, the desire to look friendly or to look compassionate or to meet the expectations of another, whether the one who's asking, who's trying to exploit you, or the onlookers who have their particular idea of what it is to be nice or good or compassionate or loving or whatever, or your own inner expectations, your own superego. It's telling you, you must do this, right? You must not do that. And the one who is seeking to exploit. Why? See, if I may give you a metaphor, seeking to extract joy, happiness, pleasure, love, peace, contentment out of another is the equivalent of trying to breathe the air out of your lungs when I've got all of this air right here. It's just insane. It's insane. It's insane. And yet, without the awareness that there's an abundance of air all around, people who don't see that joy is simply here, that peace is simply here, they see somebody else that appears to have love or appears to have joy or appears to have something that they want, whether it's some object they possess or whether it's their very body, doesn't matter, or a skill they have, whatever it may be. And they imagine not realizing there's air everywhere, and so you're walking around shallow breathing because you're afraid of losing your oxygen, and you see somebody who's breathing really nicely, and so you think you've got to come up and put your mouth around theirs or over their nose and suck the oxygen out of their lung. Where do you think they're getting it from? You see, and so you see how insane that is. It's silly, it's ridiculous as an image, but that's exactly what you're doing. That's exactly what a human being does when they think that they can extract joy, pleasure, happiness, peace, love, compassion from another. It's that exact same kind of insanity. In fact, it's even more insane than the metaphor that I just gave. And we don't see that. Which is a testament to our absolute just rotten brains. I mean, I'm not trying to be mean or nasty, but as long as that beast of guilt is in there and being fed you have to understand that the source of being itself, and this might come as a shock because of how people have been raised with certain, uh, theistic philosophies and or social philosophies, political philosophies, and whatnot. But the universe itself, life itself, has no desire for you to feel guilty. Guilt is a socially constructed and a socially utilized phenomenon. And it's a means of keeping you hostage. There is no natural state of being that you need anything or anyone else to be able to achieve or attain to or be in awareness of. You can be housed or unhoused. You can have food or no food. You can be in a relation, married or partnered or single. You can have friends or no friends. You can have money or no money. And the same joy, the same love, the same peace is accessible to you. In fact, you may find that it's easier to tap into that, to realize that, to open up to that, when you are not so encumbered with all kinds of objects that you feel you need to tend to in an obligatory manner of speaking. When you feel that life is a series of, I've got to do this, and I've got to do that, and I have to do this, and I have to do that, obligation. In that sense of duty, it's my duty to X, Y, and Z, and if I don't, then I'm a failure, or I'm terrible, or whatever value judgment. Guilt will always coincide with that. In fact, that is guilt. And as long as that guilt is there, there isn't any actual responsibility. There's feigned responsibility, there's a false responsibility, which is just a kind of violence in disguise. And living that way, people wonder why there's no joy, and why they either have to drink or do drugs or be on all kinds of medications to either feel what they want to feel or to avoid feeling what they don't want to feel. And that trend cannot stay moving at a steady rate forward, otherwise we're all dead. So there's an immediate need to relinquish guilt, all guilt. You can't act properly, appropriately, in a way that actually brings about a resolution to what ails us, as long as the motivating factor is guilt. It keeps you ensnared, it keeps you trapped, it keeps you hostage. And there's no being, there's no human who loves, who is in love, who lives as love, that wants you ensnared to guilt. It's only other guilty humans who want you to feel guilty. Please realize that. No one else can realize it for you. This is why it's called self-realization. Not only is it the realization of the true self, but only you can do it. No one else can do it for you. So you've got to be willing to see. And if you have some vested interest in feeling guilty, which you must as long as you are sustaining that emotion, whatever emotion, whatever thought form that you are sustaining, however much you tell yourself a story of it being unconscious, or, why am I feeling this way? If there's any kind of a sustained emotion taking place within oneself, and that includes guilt, there's some motivating force behind it. There's still a belief that one is doing the right thing by feeling that way, which means that one has a vested interest in sustaining that emotion, which always goes back to the belief that you're going to get something out of it, whether it's a celestial or a cosmic reward, or a social reward, or a financial reward, some kind of reward. There's a belief that there will be a reward, which is the same thing as saying an avoidance of punishment, as long as that emotion, that thought structure, is sustained. However much on the surface one laments against it and complains about it, or wishes that it would be different. If there was a 100% total and complete reconciliation or resolve for that which is sustained as the emotion to change, to be gone, to no longer persist, then it would be gone. But there's still something, there's still some belief, some narrative about how you owe it to somebody to feel that way. Otherwise, you're a bad person, right? If I don't feel guilty, then I'm terrible and I'm insensitive, right? That's the belief. It's not true. In fact, guilt brings about insensitivity. And it freezes the brain, it rots the brain. It causes the brain to be totally incapable of using the fullness of its processing abilities. It puts the brain in paralysis because now there's fear. There's fear of saying how one feels, there's fear of saying what one thinks, there's fear of saying what one sees, because there's fear of retribution. And so with guilt, there's always that feeling of retribution. Either you are going to have retribution enacted upon you if you don't stay true to that guilt complex, or the others, and, not or, but and, when you see somebody who is not caught in that same guilt complex and they're living and acting freely, you want to bring retribution against them because they're not in the cage that you have a belief that all good or decent human beings should be in. And of course, to really be a good human being, you can't be in the cage at all. There's nothing good about guilt. But this is the belief. And it's not new. It changes face every generation. The current face of guilt or the mythology around it, it changes its clothes just like everything else does as it passes through the ages. But it's the same fundamental emotion. It's the same fundamental mechanism. And to finally see it simply as a mechanism stripped of the content of its storyline is really to see it clearly, and to see the difference between the shape and the pattern and the form versus the meaningful content, if you will, that is the content of significance, of contemporary social significance, which is put into the pattern, into the shape, to give it its texture. And we get hung up on that so easily because there are all kinds of emotions attached to it. Guilt always goes with fear, it goes with anger, it goes with sorrow, and it goes with helplessness, the feeling of helplessness. I see that there's something happening that I don't like, or I don't want, or I see ought not to be happening, or shouldn't be happening, and yet I'm powerless to do anything about it. I can't do anything about it, and I can't forget that I've seen it, that I've known it, that I've experienced it. And so guilt naturally is a kind of cognitive dissonance. There's something that I want to do, or there's something that I see must be done. I can't do it. Nobody else is willing to do it. Living with the pain of that direct perception is far too much. And so guilt is the mechanism, is the way of creating distance between yourself and that feeling of the direct awareness of that which is obviously inhuman, inhumane, unconscionable, that which is violent, that which is unacceptable, right, as a human being. You can't do anything about it. And so it turns into guilt, which is a kind of undigested, unprocessed emotional baggage. And the manifestation of that, of course, not just on a large global level, but on a more individualized or personalized level, which is still global because the same things people are made to feel guilty for everywhere. Your simple being, right? Certain parts of you or aspects of you that you were told were not okay, not acceptable, and therefore, and you can't remove those things. So it's the same fundamental mechanism, right? There's something here in awareness that exists, and you don't know what to do about it. Either you see something terrible is happening, or you see something quite marvelous is here in existence, but someone tells you that it shouldn't be there and it's wrong that it's there. And so even though inwardly you see that, well, this thing is actually quite marvelous or innocent, but now the people around you are telling you that there's something wrong with it, again, there's the dissonance that's created, and the only way for you to continue to survive in that social scene, in that social milieu, is to compartmentalize, to lock away, and therefore to fragment, to create distance between you and the reality. So whether the guilt is around something which is actually, terrible, that you can't do anything about, or about something which is phenomenal, that you can't do anything about, it's a mechanism of creating distance between you and that thing which you can't do anything about, either because it needs to be addressed and changed, but nobody wants to, and you don't have the power to do so, or something that is totally natural and doesn't need to be changed, can't be changed anyway, but you're told you must. And so it's a response to emotionally being in a situation which demands resolution, but in which at that moment resolution seems impossible. And so it's a splitting off, and so it creates the shadow. It creates cognitive dissonance. And part of the feeling of going back to feel that, facing that, the very mechanism and the structure of guilt, it feels like death. Of being killed, of being brutalized, of being hurt, of being totally cut off from everything and everyone. But keeping guilt around does that, you see? And so, as a human being, it doesn't really matter when, where, why, and how. The very fact of that division and that separation has to be faced and met fearlessly with the willingness to die. That means not only the willingness for once you discover, for example, about this thing over here having been made to feel guilty or been pulled into guilt regarding something that's natural, right? It's very easy to kind of rebelliously take that back at some point and say, nope, that's mine and it's good. But with that attitude, we always end up going, past certain limits, which end up hurting ourselves in another way, right? Because we're trying to react against the guilt. But it's a little bit easier to practically handle that, at least in our immediate perception. When it comes to the perception of something which is violent and horrific happening that we know shouldn't be happening, and the helplessness in response to perceiving it and not being able to do anything about it, and the guilt complex that arises there, that can be, practically speaking anyway, a little trickier to navigate, to deal with, because at least when you stand here in the face of the resolution of this guilt, or this mode of guilt, when you realize that that guilt was the basis of a direct lie. Somebody lied to you about your being, about who you are and who they were. It's much easier to stand in resolve to that and say, I will stand here and fight, or at least I'm willing to, uh, die, uh, looking you in the eye, right? It's a little bit easier to go through that over here in this situation, but over here, it requires the same thing, but the willingness then to be looked in the eye and seen as a traitor sometimes by the people who you want to help. You see, it's easy for your own perceived enemy to see you as a traitor because they already do anyway. But it's much more difficult for the ones who you see as allies or who you see yourself as an ally to see you as a traitor, right? Morally, people find it much, if you, you know, I think I've made the point clear. Well, if you're countercultural, right, it's much easier for you to take the bane of the mainstream culture. When you're first growing up, you try to conform to the mainstream culture. You realize you can't, or how ridiculous or stupid that is, how it keeps you fragmented, and so you stand in yourself, come what may, right? Because who cares what they think? They were the ones that lied in the first place and caused all the suffering and the harm and the damage, right? And allowed it to be. So it's much easier to say, who cares? Over there. But over here, when you see people who are suffering, as you have suffered, but you see there's people suffering, right? And you see that throwing yourself into suffering in the same way only adds one more body to the count. It doesn't actually resolve the suffering. And that to resolve that suffering, to bring an end to that suffering, requires bringing an end to guilt, because that very guilt, which is the nature and the root of that suffering, is also the cause of it, as the ones who are perpetrating the suffering on the ones who are suffering is rooted in their guilt anyway. And so you see, it doesn't matter on which side of the fence anybody perceives themselves to be, the root of it all is guilt. It's the same root, whether it's on this side or that side. And so wherever you're standing, you cutting the root is the only chance you and anybody else has got. And that takes a very subtleness of awareness and perception. And when somebody is suffering, when someone's being tortured, and inwardly, outwardly, however they are, and they see someone else who isn't being tortured, unless they are of very sound and stable mind, it causes that reaction of, I'm suffering, why aren't they suffering? It's always me, they're not suffering, right? They need to suffer too. And if you're sensitive and you see somebody suffering, and that guilt has been awakened in you somehow, there's that feeling of sympathy that you then believe that you've got to put yourself through some kind of pain or torture or torment in order to be in solidarity with the ones who are suffering. You see? And if you don't do that, and the ones who are suffering believe that you should be suffering too, and you refuse to suffer, then you are perceived as the enemy, even though your full compassion is right there in the desire to make the suffering stop. But you see intelligently and clearly that adding yourself to the list of the suffering doesn't bring an end to anybody's suffering. It just creates more suffering. And then finally you see that this and this really aren't different. It's one and the same. It's one and the same. If you're going to divide it, one is simply what happens one step before the other. It's this that leads to this. And so it's really the same movement, it's the same guilt, it's the same. And so finally, one has to see that there's absolutely no reason. You don't need to feel guilty in order to act responsibly to bring resolution to what needs to be resolved. Either you can solve the problem or you can learn from it, but sitting around feeling guilty about being who you are, how you are, where you are, does absolutely nothing for anybody. And anybody who is conscious, anybody who is in love, anybody who is aware of the eternal nature of being, doesn't want anybody else to feel guilty, doesn't want anybody else to rot in that prison, doesn't want anybody else to be in that shame. It's only ignorance that wants to spread guilt and that wants to keep anybody locked in a cell of guilt. And so finally you have to see that you and only you can liberate yourself from that cell. Nobody else can, and nobody else will. Especially not people who are suffering. When you're suffering, and you're caught in the belief that you will always be made to suffer, naturally in that state, which goes along with anger, which goes along with grief, which goes along with the violence and the trauma that it is, the only thing that you could want, at best, even without intending it, so you might, if one is very clear, one can see this must stop and this must not spread. But then if you see that it must not spread, then you, even though you're in that state of pain, you don't want anybody else to be there either. But actually, there are people that say, I'm suffering, but I don't want anybody else to. But then they do all kinds of things to create it, right? And so, actually, and so this is that apparent dividing line between consciousness and unconsciousness. So when there's consciousness, which is what everything leads back to, all roads lead to Rome, all roads lead to the summit of Mount Fuji, all roads lead to consciousness. Consciousness is the beginning and the end of everything. And so in consciousness, you see clearly there's no need for guilt, and no being that lives in consciousness wants anybody else to be in guilt. It's only unconsciousness that one has guilt, that is guilty, but that wants guilt for others, you see? And so when you see that there's literally no place for it, there's no good place for it. It's purely, it's a destructive emotion. It's an emotion of manipulation. It's an emotion of coercion. It's an emotion of stagnation. It's an emotion of rot. When you see that clearly, it's done. It's done. It doesn't matter what the situation is. It doesn't matter what the situation is. And so you see then that you don't owe the world or anybody your guilt. In fact, what you do owe the world, what you do owe life, what you do owe everybody is your freedom. Your joy. Not owe in the sense of pack it up in a box and, pay it as tribute. No. You owe life the fact of you being a liberated, free, sovereign being. That's the only way you're ever going to help anybody else be free or liberated, is by you living free and liberated. Your bondage only serves to keep everybody else in bondage. Your freedom only serves to further the end of everybody else's. Your joy, your peace, your love opens the prison doors and sets the captives free. Solidarity and guilt is not solidarity. That's just nonsense. And it doesn't matter what the contemporary philosophies about any of this are. The thing about being human is that it is eternal. Consciousness is eternal. The nature of consciousness is eternal. And therefore, when there is unconsciousness, which unconsciousness itself is not eternal, it's temporal, but as it manifests, it always obeys the same laws and structures. Form, or formlessness, is eternal, form is temporal. And formlessness being eternal, its laws are eternal, its nature is eternal, its implications are eternal. And therefore, whenever form appears, whenever limitation appears, limitation is always limitation. Its laws only impact only are effective within its small sphere, but it doesn't matter where and when that sphere appears, the laws that appear will also be always the same, because limitation is limitation. It has a beginning and an end. And everything with a beginning and an end is subject to birth and death, and all of the physics that implies, from beginning to end. And that which is formless, that which is eternal, which has no beginning and end, no birth and death, obviously then has its eternal implications, its eternal reality, which doesn't come and go, so therefore it's anyway always present. So, silly social philosophies are meaningless. They're all reactions against other meaningless social philosophies from the previous generation. And so every generation has its reactionary philosophies against the previous and the previous and the previous, which, if you look at it clearly, just leads to a very slow but very noticeable degradation of the brain and of the human heart and character over the millennia. It's hardly noticeable, but it just and the only restorative action, not that there isn't always great, every generation produces its greatness, but we're not building pyramids anymore. Do you understand? We're trying to come close to simulating that with the other modes of construction that we have, but nothing that we build comes close to that mastery. And there are fewer and fewer masters every generation, apparently. However, we're certainly on the rise once again. But for us as a globe, as a world, to really enter into restorative awareness, or to rise as we never have before, as a globe, as a species, as a humanity, we have to step into consciousness, which means awareness of what's eternal. And what's eternal is what is, as we just saw. It's what is. It's eternal. It has no beginning, no end, no birth, no death, and so therefore its laws, its implications are simply eternal in what they are. And that which is limited, that which has a beginning and an end, a birth and a death, though the physical movement of that takes place in a limited sphere, in a limited pocket, whenever it arises, it's always the same physics, the same mode of physics, because beginning and end, birth and death, therefore totally physically defined, measured within its scope and scale, must have a limited physics, and that limited physics can be known. And it's the same whether it appears here or here or here or here or here or here, or it doesn't matter. And so when you see that clearly, there's freedom. There's freedom. There's freedom. There's freedom. You see, the only sensible thing to do is to simply sit here in ease, in calmness, in peace, in love, and in joy, which is the natural state. It's what you are. Either you can do something about something, or you can't do something about something. And you can only do what you can do. You can only do what you're in contact with, whether locally or non-locally, physically or at a distance. But outside of what you can do, and all capacity to do in the physical is limited. You can only do what you can do. Outside of that, you can only do what you can do. So you either can solve a problem, or you can learn from it. But you see, feeling guilty is totally useless. It atrophies the brain. It prevents you from being able to solve a problem. It prevents you from being able to learn. It puts you in the time capsule and keeps you stuck. However, your being itself, your compassion, which is limitless, compassion is eternal, love is eternal, peace is eternal. There's no beginning or end, no birth or death to it, because they're not dependent upon any objects or any circumstances. Love is not something that's dependent upon another. Compassion is not dependent upon another. It's not selective. It's not limited. It encompasses everything. And so your compassion, your awareness, your consciousness encompasses everything, is in contact with everything. Which is why your liberation helps set everybody free. But your action is limited. Compassion is unlimited. Love is unlimited. Peace is unlimited. Because it's simply the being that you are. It's simply the consciousness that you are. And you can simply sit here and bask in it. And that sends out an incredible vibration that uplifts everything and everybody, whether they feel it or not. It makes liberation easier for everybody else. The more liberated beings, the more liberated beings. But physically, all physical action is limited, obviously. You can do or you can't do. That's why Yoda says, don't try, do or don't do. And it's true. You can do something or you can't do something. And the capacity to see, I can't do that. Not as a self-defeating, and people will say, never say can't. It's like, bruh, I can't jump 20 feet into the air with this body. Maybe if, some superpowers get unlocked. But let's not be silly, right? All of that is completely beside the point. People like to speculate about those dimensions. Which are totally useless to us as long as we're still here destroying one another. But the physical human body without assistance cannot jump from here to the moon. It's not what it's made for. Anyway, so, you can't just sprout 5 more arms from your rib cage. You can sit here and try all you want. You can try to meditate yourself into sprouting physically more limbs. Well, you'll probably die first. You see? And so there's nothing wrong with that. As it is right now in this moment, I can't speak Swahili. There are some I can speak, a handful of languages, but there are many more languages that I can't speak. Now, in this moment, I don't have the ability. That means, I don't have the knowledge, right? Do I have the ability? Yeah, I have the ability. I have the ability to do anything and everything that I can do. But I don't have the knowledge in this moment, physically, to do all of that. It takes time to learn. If I want to speak better French, then I have to sit down and I have to learn French. That takes time, right? And then I can say I can speak it. Or whatever language or whatever skill, right? And so ability, physical capacity is always limited, always takes place in a sphere. This body is this body. It can only be in one place at a time. Please don't go off into fancies about bilocation and we're not going into non-physical or energetic awarenesses, which are anyway speculations for most people, right? we're staying very grounded right now. This body can only be in one place. And so its capacity to perform action, right? If I tried to bench press, 200 pounds right now, could I train myself up to that point? Yeah, if I wanted to. But right now in this moment, unless I had like a crazy, adrenaline, rush going, it's very unlikely. So the physical body is always limited. So what you can do, you can do. What you can't do, you can't do. And that has to be faced. But your consciousness is all-encompassing. There's no limitation to consciousness. There's no limitation to compassion. There's no limitation to love. There's no limitation to peace. It's totally unbound and free. And the willingness to simply be here in it, not only is it your birthright, but it's also your responsibility. It's the responsibility of every human being to be free. It's the responsibility of every human being to be in compassion, to be in love, to be in peace. To not be in guilt, to not spread guilt. Which you do when you act out of guilt. So, you can be as you'd like. That's your freedom. You are free as a human being. You are liberated, whether you realize it or not. And that's the truth. When you come into the realization of the ultimate nature of freedom, you see that you always were free, and everybody is free. And it's so beautiful because you're free. And it also removes the veil that is the social mythology, that is the pretense of unconsciousness. Because you see, people in their freedom choose to be bound. People in their consciousness choose to pretend to be unconscious. People pretend, or they choose to pretend to be unaware. People choose to operate mechanically on autopilot so as to avoid feeling. It's a way of going numb. People choose numbness. People choose to be inhumane and then act like they had no choice. There's always a choice. And in fact, when you see the reality of consciousness and unconsciousness, there really is no choice, because no sane conscious being would choose unconsciousness. There has to be a, it's very insane to choose unconsciousness. It's a great power, and it's one of the capacities of freedom. And it's a choice that seems more rational in the face of unconsciousness. When a being is confronted, especially when they're a child, right? You're a child, you're confronted with unconsciousness. The choice to unconsciousness yourself sometimes seems like, or you could argue it is, the only shield against, the only protection against another manifestation of unconsciousness. The problem is then that shield, once used, is then clung to as the shield, and then it ends up just resorting in the living of a very distorted life. A violent life. A traumatized life. And so, seeing that the same power of mind that created that shield is the same power of mind that can release that shield, or that form, that structure which has been built as the wall, can be demolished just as easily as it was built. And that in mind you can build anything at any time. If you need a new structure of thought, you can build it, and then you can let it go as soon as you need to let it go. Because the blueprint for any kind of structure of mind is in the field of memory. so you don't have to carry around, you don't have to say, okay, this, and, carry a bunch of things around. You build something with thought and you let it go. Because if you need to access the blueprint again, you just pull it up out of space itself. You just reach right into space, and everything that can be remembered is there to be remembered. All the structures and patterns of thought that have ever been useful can be recalled if they're needed, but they don't need to be hung on to. They can all be sent back to the void. And anyway, when you're simply in the void, free-floating, you see the nature of formlessness again, and the nature of form, and so you can pull memory up and then pull from the memory bag if you need to, but even better than that, if you can simply take thought and form it in any way you need spontaneously in response to what's here. And then as you're rolling through the environment, this is the process of learning, you're seeing, you're aware of the environment as it's shifting and as it's changing, and so you can